In this video, we're going to start to talk about variables. Now, there's a few different places that you can access variables and create variables within this orchestrator. And right now, you can see that on the left-hand side over here, I'm in an area that says variables. But really, these variables here are global variables, which means that you can access these variables across workflows. So not one single workflow will this relate to. It'll relate to all of them. So you could choose to either update or receive this global variable and share it across all of your workflows. So how do we create these global variables? So we go into new variable, and you'll see that we have a data type. And these data types really conform to the same types of data types that you would see with any programming language. You have things like a Boolean, that's a 0 or 1. You have your date and time, which is pretty self-evident. You have a decimal, you have an integer, you have a secure string. A secure string is one that you actually won't see the string again once you actually type something in. And that way you can use it for things like passwords. And then you have a string. The other option here is to add a new type, and we'll get into that a little bit later in this video. So for right now, let's just choose a string, and we'll give it a name. And I'll just call it name for right now. And the other thing that you have to consider here is the scope. In this particular example, you have something called environment, which is rarely used, so we won't cover that right now, and global. So since this is a global variable that's going to be used everywhere, really what you're going to choose is global. And you just give it an initial value. So you could just say, okay, my name is Mike. So I'm just going to put Mike in there. Now we have a global variable of name, and the value is Mike. And you could use that within, any one of your workflows. One of the other things you can do is create a variable type here. So if I want to create a variable type, what that does is create a structure of a type table. And it allows me to define things that really in the back end are really JSON structures. So let's say I wanted to create something around sports. I can create a table called sports. And what I can do is give it maybe a type, so I can enter the type. And I also want the field to show the type with a string, and I won't even give it a max length, but you could. And then you could decide whether it's required or not. And you could see that there's min max there. And also I'm going to give it maybe a name. So you might want to say, hey, this is the type of sport that is baseball, and my name is Michael. So what we do here is we just click submit. And if I scroll down now, you'll see that I have a variable type that is called sports. Now, in order to use that variable type, it's very simple. You can just say, I want to create a new variable. And you'll see that this goes down pretty far. But I can choose the variable type sports and then give it a name. We'll call it sport. And we'll keep it global. And it asks if we want any initial values here. So do we want any initial values to be set up? But we don't need to. We could just leave it as is, and we'll say submit. So now I created a global variable called sports of the type table that is sports. Now, let's talk about some other variables. We talked about that global variables will be used throughout all of the workflows. But what if you want to make something that's local? So in this new workflow, if I just click anywhere in this empty area here, even if there was actions, if you click on an empty area, you get the properties of your workflow. And if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see there's variables here. Now the variables within the workflow are just that. They are locally scoped, meaning that their value will disappear after the workflow is run. So when the workflow is done, no more variables. So if I click add variable here, you'll see that you have the same values and the same variable types that we had before. But in this case, these will only be used within the workflow run itself. So if I give this a name, I'll just call it name again. And you'll see there's different scopes though down here. So in the workflow or the local variable area here, you can have some choices of scope. So you can have something that is input. What does that mean? That means that if it is a workflow, it will actually prompt the user for an input. Now, if you save this workflow as an atomic workflow, which means that it's a snippet, like a Lego piece that you use within other workflows, then it would actually prompt the workflow for the input. So again, if you're a workflow, it prompts the user. If you're an atomic action, it prompts the workflow. So we'll see that in some later videos. Local means that it's just a variable you're going to set within the workflow, and it will disappear after the workflow is done. Output is used when you want to take the output of a previous step and save it within a workflow and set it for output value. And static is just something that you want to use within your workflow. So those are the types of things that you can use and the types of scopes that we have to use within the workflow variables. And that's pretty much it for our variable topics.